Hello, I'm Henry Bonsu, and this is Doubling Down, where every week we tackle a topic that's got you talking on social media and beyond. Joining me today are the cultural critic Father Frank Gelly and Sylvie Abdrabbuh, the Executive Director of the Policy Centre for African Peoples. Thank you very much for coming in. Good to see you both. Now, it's been described by the UN as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Yemen's three-year war has pitted forces loyal to the resigned President Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi against the Houthi movement. What makes this conflict so deadly is the involvement of external actors such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Supported by Britain, France and the US, the Saudis have been trying to restore Hadi by bombing the Houthis and other opposition groups into submission. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch accuse Riyadh of killing thousands of civilians by targeting markets, convoys, weddings, and in an air attack led by the Saudi-led coalition last month, dozens of people were killed, including many children on a school bus. The resulting humanitarian crisis has put over 8 million people at risk of starvation, including nearly 400,000 children under the age of 5. Even more are at risk from the world's biggest cholera outbreak. But while the situation gets worse, there seems little sense of urgency from the major agencies, Western countries and the Saudi alliance. It leaves observers wondering what it will take to bring the world's most terrible conflict to an end. Panel, let's go straight to you, Sylvie and Frank. Just thinking around the world at the moment, there are many crises. You've got Syria, it's been going on for a number of years, Myanmar, South Sudan. Some of our viewers might be wondering what makes Yemen the worst. And I'm just wondering what you make of that. Sylvie, first of all.
Really, in terms of the proportions, it's really a humanitarian crisis. Millions, more than 20 million Yemenis have been displaced and millions are starving. And then really the numbers killed, tens and thousands of people killed, including children. This is really dreadful. And then also, the fact is there is the involvement of external factors and external agents such as Saudi Arabia, which is leading a coalition, and then, of course, supported by the West.
Yes.
So that brings it into really a lot of relevance in terms of it being in the news. But really, it's first and foremost a human tragedy.
I mean, Father, as a man of the cloth, as somebody who sees things through not just a political but also through a moral lens, when you look at the tragedy of Yemen, and it's been going on for a long time, how does it make you feel? What do you think?
Well, it's heart-rending. There is no need to emphasize that because, as Sylvia was saying, the sight especially of children suffering, outbreaks of cholera, hospitals being bombed, all sorts of atrocious violations of human rights hitting the defenseless, the helpless people, from children to women to old people, is abominable. Yeah. However, the moral argument here is the involvement of the United Kingdom with the Saudi regime. We send military experts which are on the ground, which our government claims they're not involved operationally, but I wonder what they're there to do otherwise. There is selling of arms. There is a close connection on security. And we are told again and again we need the links with the Saudis in order to counter terrorists, to be safer at home. Well,
and of course the jobs that they keep talking about in the aerospace industry.
Yes, because somebody else will help him anyway.
Sylvie's raising her eyebrows.
I think I feel conflicted about it because on the one hand, as Frank is rightly pointing out, we have such a lack of morality and humanitarian considerations in terms of the involvement of the West, the United States and the United Kingdom. But on the other hand, number one, there are some Western countries like the Spanish government, for instance, that has just stopped selling arms to Saudi Arabia out of these humanitarian considerations. But I also I feel conflicted about the argument people usually make in terms of condemning the West for giving arms to Saudi Arabia. First and foremost, the Saudis are active agents, and really they are the first that are leading this coalition, and they should be the one we condemn most. And it's really...
Their defense would be, this is in our backyard. When something happened in the UK's backyard, they get involved.
Then it's a confirmation of what we already blatantly know, which is that countries are led by their interest first and foremost. So we have to see it in the prism of the power struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran, that no party wants to let it go. But I really don't think it should be an argument about the West. It should be more about what are the regional countries doing and where is the way forward?
Well, we'll try and get to that during this program. We're not going to solve it, I know that, but we'll try and get to it. And always putting people at the heart of this, the people on the ground who need help. And as if to underline the crisis in Yemen, people have been taking to the streets in the north and south of the country. They've had enough. No income, soaring prices, a collapsed currency, and a devastated infrastructure. But these conditions of war come after years of high inflation and food shortages in what has long been the poorest country in the Arab world. And on top of this, there's disease on a massive scale, as highlighted recently by the United Nations.
And our humanitarian colleagues tell us that the number of suspected cholera cases in Yemen has been increasing over the last 2 months. Since April 2017, more than 1.1 million suspected cholera cases and 2,310 associated deaths have been reported across Yemen. The outbreak is the most serious on record. Between the beginning of the year and mid-August 2018, 120,000 suspected cases have been reported, although this figure is lower than during the same period last year. The increasing rate of infection over the recent weeks is raising concerns of a possible third wave of the epidemic, with the current rains increasing the risk of spread.
So that's the perspective of the United Nations on the cholera outbreak. Let's talk to Dr. Issa Bloomy now. He's the author of Destroying Yemen, What Chaos in Arabia Tells Us About the World. And he's a specialist on Asia and the Middle East at Stockholm University, and he joins us via Skype from the city of Malmö. Dr. Bloomy, I mean, you heard what's being said so far and the perspective of the UN. But first of all, this question: why is Yemen being destroyed?
First of all, thank you for allowing me to share some of my insights with your audience. The case of Yemen actually extends well into the beginning of the 20th century. It's one of those, let's say, sovereign polities that have resisted globalization and forms of finance capitalism that has reigned supreme over the last 100-some years in the larger world. And somewhat paradoxically, while statistically one of the poorest countries these days, it is in fact one of the most wealthy countries in terms of natural resources that have yet to be tapped, from the oil and gas, which is always the case in the Middle East, but also its fisheries and its farmlands and its water resources, and more importantly, perhaps to all the countries involved in this war now, its location. It is literally, they were planning, in fact, to build a bridge that would link Djibouti with Yemen and therefore link all the developments of the Horn of Africa over the last 20 years with Southern Arabia. So destroying Yemen actually means destroying this over a century-long period of resistance to global capitalism, to globalization, perhaps, if you want to call it that. And this has been the last kind of breath of an attempt by a neighboring puppet of this global capitalist regime, Saudi Arabia and the family of the Sauds, in surviving this transitional period, which is in many ways starts in 2007-2008, the scramble for liquidity, financial liquidity, which has affected much of the world, and steering much of this third world savings, or excess cash, if you will, away from places like Dubai, or indeed Aden and Sana'a were receiving development money, and steering it back to the West. To
this is a very interesting picture you're presenting us with, Dr. Bloomy, because some people have been concentrating on ethnic and religious divides within the country, talking about regional actors. Do you think the picture we've been presented with then is far too simplistic?
These simplistic kind of uses of terms that refer to primitive types of polities has long been used to basically give carte blanche to so-called developed countries to continue business as is. Yes, there is, of course, local conflicts. Many of the local actors have taken advantage of the availability of weapons and availability of funding to try to steer Yemen's wealth into certain directions. But without the role of the great imperialist powers of the last 150 years, you would have a very different kind of situation on the ground. The same applies to any other part of the so-called third world, right? So we really have to, while I appreciate the sympathies and the rhetoric from one of your panelists, I do have to point the accusatory finger to, ultimately, the Americans, who are the kind of struggling global empire who is trying to secure, through its influence over Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Qatar is now somewhat out of the picture as of now. But we must not forget that, again, the global powers are the ones who are the biggest beneficiaries of any kind of steering of the resources of that region into the so-called global market.
So given what you're saying, Dr. Blumey, I'm just wondering how much faith one should have in this new set of talks that are now underway in Geneva, if the considerations on the table are between the great powers and their puppets, and they're not really thinking about the people who have been suffering for so long.
Unfortunately, the UN has been proven once again to be an unreliable arbiter to conflicts, and it certainly has served the interest of power interest for a long time. And this is certainly the case with Yemen. It has constantly suppressed the numbers of civilian deaths. It's constantly kind of given carte blanche. It's even offered Saudi Arabia a place at the table in discussing human rights, which is, of course, a farce in its own right. But this is a meeting that has been designed to fail and to try to blame one of the local resistance kind of coalitions, the Ansar Allah, or what we call in the West the Houthis, who have not even, their delegates have not even been allowed to leave North Yemen because they have not been given clearance, and yet they're being accused for not showing up to Geneva. So this is the kind of games that we've seen before from Saudi Arabia and its partners, and unfortunately this will be a way to actually place blame on those who are being bombed and who are under siege and being starved for the last 3.5 years.
That's a very bleak picture, Dr. Issa Blumey. For the moment, thank you very much. What say you, Frank?
I want to look at a strategic dimension. Saudi Arabia is pursuing a regional dominance strategy. It wants to preserve itself in power, and I'm speaking about not all the princes, particularly King Salman and the Crown Prince, to perpetuate their power. It can be argued the internal situation in Saudi Arabia is close to chaos. It could explode any time.
Yeah.
In 1979, there was a famous uprising in Mecca led by Juhayman al-Utabi. They took over the Kaaba, and it was made the Saudi regime shake in its boots. Now, there is still a lot of opposition inside the country. But so the Saudi regime wants to assert its power over Yemen. Incidentally, the Roman name for Yemen was Arabia Felix, Happy Arabia. Unhappy Arabia.
That's a misnomer if ever I heard one. We've got to move on because we've got people watching and they want to get involved here. And although the crisis in Yemen has been ignored by much of the international media, you certainly feel strongly about it. I'm talking about you at home, as we can see on social media. So let's see what's being said in the Twitter sphere, first of all. And this from Malik: Yemen's economy threatens to kill far more people than bombs. The situation is grave. If something is not done to solve this issue, even more innocents will die. Lynn says, for the first time in years, peace talks are being held in an effort to end the war in Yemen. For Yemen's children, it's time for peace. On to Dave, who says, Yemen needs leadership, a big visionary who will drive political accommodation, stabilize the economy, blunt the humanitarian crises, and ultimately chart a path of peace and reconciliation in Yemen. And let's move on to Facebook now. First of all, with Nick, who says, Saudi's airstrike on a school bus is nothing short of a war crime. Nothing can justify the killing of children. The Saudis claim the attack was legitimate. When is killing children and civilians legitimate? Rochelle says, disgusting. 15 of the 9/11 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Yet that country is not on the US travel ban. Trump sells them a bunch of weapons so they can kill children in Yemen. He has so much blood on his hands. Great job for a year and a half. Anthony says, Yemen is yet another complicated conflict in the Middle East. However, I think Spain has done the right thing, halting major missile sales to Saudi Arabia. One thing's for certain, these bombs devastate civilian populations, creating more displaced people as well as death and destruction. Thank you for those. Now remember, you can always get involved in the conversation on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram by using the handle Doubling Down TV. So you're concerned about what's happening in Yemen, but what about the so-called international community? Well, the first attempt at talks in 2 years is underway in Geneva, and last month a group of UN experts released their long-awaited report into the crisis.
The group of eminent experts has reasonable grounds to believe that parties to the armed conflict in Yemen have committed a substantial number of violations of international humanitarian law, subject to a determination by an independent and competent court. That is, individuals in the government of Yemen and the coalition, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, may have conducted attacks in violation of the principles of distinction, proportionality, and/or precautions, which may amount to war crimes, and also acts that may amount to war crimes, including cruel treatment and torture, outrages upon personal dignity, rape, and conscripting or enlisting children under the age of 15.
Professor Charles Garraway, one of the UN's group of eminent experts. So, might this report and the ongoing talks bring us any closer to easing the suffering in Yemen? Dr. Issa Bloomy is still with us, so we can ask him that now. Dr. Bloomy, what do you say, or how much hope do you invest in this new report? Because, yes, the report was widely covered, but I'm not sure where it will take us.
The report is telling and repeats the storyline that I made before earlier about how the United Nations obscures as much as highlights or sheds light on the perpetrators of mass crimes against humanity. This exonerates by not mentioning in words the major outside powers who are providing the weapons, the refueling capacity, indeed even the targeting. The sites that are being hit daily, from infrastructure to factories to hospitals to ports, are in fact provided by American military assets, if you will.
If this report isn't going to move the needle, what do you think will? Because I was even talking to a human rights worker just yesterday, and he was in Sana'a trying to distribute relief, and he says the picture is unbelievable. You cannot imagine it, and I guess people at home cannot really feel it. They cannot really connect with it, and I'm just wondering what hope those people in Sana'a and elsewhere in Aden, around the country, what can they look to for relief, for help?
They don't. They resort to civic unrest. You see throughout the so-called liberated parts of southern Yemen, and they're burning tires and burning portraits of those so-called liberators as we speak. And of course, in the most populated parts of Yemen, which is under siege now for 3.5 years, they have no recourse but to resist. And that's why this populist call for the Popular People's Army, which extends well beyond anything of loyalties to one charismatic man named Houthi, makes this a national resistance. That this is the only recourse that people have. It will have to take ultimately the pressure from the outside. Spain's gesture today or yesterday is an indication that civic activism in Spain itself has put enough political pressure to finally forced the Spanish to stop selling weapons. They've been selling weapons for 3.5 years, however, before then. So it really does take the people on the streets in these countries that provide the kind of logistical support, provide diplomatic cover. And while there will be this occasional UN reference to collective responsibility for human rights violations, this war is not going to stop until one of two things happens. And this is what my argument is that Saudi Arabia goes bankrupt. It no longer has the capacity to borrow money to pay for its bills, which has happened in certain cases regarding Canada, for instance, or the resistance will collapse in North Yemen. And that's only going to happen when millions of people die of starvation, because these people have nowhere else to go. They're not given an option. Their option is to go back to how it was in late 2014, which was to live under extreme austerity, loss of sovereignty, all of the natural resources being refunneled to service the interest of the City of London, Wall Street, and others. And this is not the solution for them. That's what basically the outside world is telling Yemenis today. You must accept us returning to how it was before 2014.
And what do you think the Arab world is telling Yemen, the people in the Gulf Cooperation Council, etc.? As you travel around the Arab world and you talk to people about Yemen, what do they say to you? If you go to Dubai, if you go to Saudi or Qatar, how do they see the Yemenis? As their troubled cousins, as their poor cousins, their poor relations?
The man on the street knows Yemenis by stereotype as tough guys who are not necessarily the most reliable in terms of law-abiding citizens in countries where they're guest workers or whatever. But the GCC is a divided enterprise. It has in fact been its factions have been exposed by this war in Yemen, and the reason why you have these three different powers fighting through assets, through proxies on the ground in Yemen is basically because they all face very similar kinds of structural long-term problems that can only be resolved by securing the assets of Yemen while denying them to the other two competing entities. So Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE have very different sets of interest in Yemen, but one of the most important ones is to make sure that in the case of Abu Dhabi, for instance, not to allow Saudi Arabia to steal the oil and gas, which they had been able to, through contracts under Ali Abdullah Saleh, gain access to in the 1990s and early 2000s.
Okay. Dr. Issa Blumi from Stockholm University speaking to us from Malmo. Thank you very much indeed. Panel, I'm just wondering what the way forward is going to be, because he was very clear about why this is happening, why Yemen is being destroyed, Sylvie.
Yes, Dr. Blooming made an excellent point there in terms of citizens' activism.
Yeah.
Being able to change the foreign policies of the countries. This is the advantages those who are living in the West have, in that they are in democratic countries and they can actually start protesting.
But for you to be active, you have to look in the eyes of that Yemeni child or that Yemeni person and see a human being like you.
Exactly. And say we can no longer tolerate this.
Frank, looking forward, how do you see it?
I certainly believe that the situation is dramatic. In practical terms, there is a report commissioned by my postgraduate college, King's College London, about the security cooperation with Saudi Arabia. Is it worth it for the UK? They make 3 recommendations. One, that this relationship should be scrutinized. It should be critical. It should not give the Saudis everything they want under the pretext the common terrorism.
Number 2.
Second, it should be transparent. We should know what's going on. No secrecy. It's not enough for the government to say we don't have to, we can't release information. Yeah. And thirdly, it should be based on activism. It's interesting, we need another, certainly activism here in the West, but we need another Arab Spring in the Middle East, as Sylvia was
Are people still
implying.
using that term? I've heard other different terms. I've heard Islamic awakening. Arab uprising, you call it the Spring.
Arab Spring.
It sounds too Western. Arab Spring? No.
Well,
an awakening of some kind.
I'm not arguing about words.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
not a
yeah.
semantic thing.
Yes.
But that was a spontaneous movement from the people. It was not ideological. It was not a matter of falling back on religious criteria, fundamental criteria, or in either this hoary Marxist rhetoric, which we just heard a great deal a moment ago.
Okay.
That is something which came from below.
You have landed. That is it. You need tools. Thank you very much.
The eagle has landed.
The ego has landed. And that's it for this week. Thanks very much to my studio guests, Sylvie Abdrabbuh and Father Frank Gelly and Dr. Issa Bloomy, who was on the line. For news of next week's topic and to get your views in early, check out Doubling Down on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.